Thanks a lot, Chris. That's great words. Yeah, so I'm not the first speaker, so nobody panic. It's not me. It is my pleasure, however, to introduce you for our first speaker, which is Professor Paul Cullinan from Imperial, our homegrown here. Paul is a respiratory physician and is going to talk to you a bit about Vapours, actually, which is really interesting in terms of inhalation and really from a clinician's perspective. All the speakers have been tasked with giving probably an hour-long talk on their subject, but condensing it into 15 minutes. So thank God I'm not speaking, but these bunch of speakers are definitely more than well equipped to do that. So Paul, it's an absolute pleasure to have you. Thanks for agreeing, and it's all yours.
Thank you, Roger, and thank you to the organisers for a very honoured invitation. So, as Roger's indicated, I've taken my brief very seriously, and we'll talk from a clinician's point of view, which immediately puts me at a disadvantage in a room full of clever people like you. But perhaps it's a good warm-up act, Roger. As Roger's indicated, I didn't want to tread on the toes of the giants who follow me, so I've taken a slightly liberal view of what a particle is, and I'm going to talk about chemical vapours and their capacity to cause asthma. And part of my job is working at the Brompton Hospital in London. I'm a chest physician, and every Monday afternoon we run a clinic for people who may have developed lung problems from their work. And about 4 or 5 years ago, we were asked to see this young woman, to see whether we could help this young woman who worked as a jeweller in a fashionable part of London. Actually, what she did was oversee a team of about 8 or 9 people in a fairly small, I think, underventilated workshop, assembling things like this amulet, and then selling them online. And she started this job in January 2018 and had been in perfect health at that point. But 5 or 6 months later, noticed that her nose was running frequently and that her chest was tight and wheezy, and quite quickly put 2 and 2 together and said, it's only when I've been at work that I feel like this. And in one way or other found her way to us. This gap of 5 or 6 months is we would call a latent period, and it's quite important clinically and when we're thinking about mechanisms. And we'll come back to that later if we've got time. Now, she thought it was something at work, and we thought she was probably right. And our suspicions fell on the glues that she and her colleagues were using. And there were 3 glues. There's a solvent glue, an epoxy resin system, and a methacrylate. To a clinician like me, I'm no chemist. It's basically Airfix glue, Araldite, and super glue. And the question was one of these glues responsible, and if so, which one was it? Because if we could identify which one it was, perhaps we could rearrange things so that she didn't get ill anymore. And the first thing we did was look at their safety data sheets and identify whether they were labeled as capable of causing asthma. And you can see, you won't be surprised that the solvent glue isn't, the epoxy is, and the methacrylate does not carry that label. Anyway, what we did was invite her to come into hospital and undergo what we call a specific inhalation challenge test, which is a grand name for asking her to sit in an exposure chamber and more or less do what she does at work and see what happens. And we did this on a number of days. And the results are shown there on this graph. So along the bottom is time. And you'll see that we're asking her to make measurements for up to 11 hours after exposure. And on the y-axis is an indication of her lung function, which each day we set to 0. And you can, in that way, see whether her lung function is falling or not following exposure to these glues separately. So on the first day, she uses the solvent glue, that's the green line there, and she has no symptoms and nothing happens. On the second day, we suggest she uses both of the other glues together, and that's the green line there, the pale green line. And quite quickly she develops a runny nose, and then towards the afternoon begins to feel her chest getting tight. And you can see quite a profound drop in her lung function by about 25% after a minute or two of exposure. She then decided that she'd like to know which of these two glues was the culprit, and you can see in the remaining two lines that she has an identical response after exposure to methacrylate, but not to the epoxy resin. And we can discuss why that might be. It's about bioavailability in a minute or two. And we were able to conclude, I think, with a high degree of certainty that this woman's developed asthma as a result of exposures she's encountered in the workplace, in this case, methacrylate. Now, quite quickly, finger pointing starts in cases like this. And we could sort of ask ourselves rhetorically who we want to point the fingers at. We, of course, would exonerate the woman herself, but her employer wouldn't. And we can, again, if there's time, discuss why that might be. The employer, I think, could reasonably claim that the glue that caused the problems was not labelled as in an appropriate manner. And we might wonder whether the manufacturers or distributors of this glue perhaps should have been a bit more careful about their labelling. Now, this is not a one-off case. We see one or two of these every year. And I've written over the years, half-heartedly, I admit, to the distributors and manufacturers of methacrylates, and they never write back. Or if they do write back, they say, show us the evidence. And it's true, the evidence has not been particularly strong. So you might add to this list clinicians, because we see these patients, we sympathize, we wring our hands, and then we just move on to the next patient. We're not letting anybody know in any systematic manner that these chemicals are out there causing problems. So you might add people like me to the bottom of this list. Anyway, I sort of on the basis of this became quite interested in how chemicals do or do not get labelled as asthmagens, respiratory sensitizers. Now, I'm going to talk about REACH, which is probably the most stupid thing I could do in a room full of people who know far more about it than I do. But it's a sort of respiratory sensitizer angle, and just to let you know what happened following this case with this particular chemical. And please, you accept the fact that I know a lot less about this than you do. But to my understanding, the original focus of REACH was what ECHO call the CMRs, the carcinogens, the mutagens, the reprotoxins, which they would propose for classifications as substances of very high concern. But about 5 years ago, another categorization was introduced, substances of equivalent concern, and these include the potential for labeling respiratory sensitizers. Now, you may or may not think that was a reasonable thing to do, but it got done. And over the years, a number of sensitizers have indeed entered the SVHC list on these grounds, and we'll come to that in a minute or two. And the process, at least as I understand it, of how chemicals get classified, as in this case as a sensitizer, is in sort of 3 stages. There's a kind of arraignment in blue on the left, there's a sort of trial in green, and then there's sentencing in red on the right. And any member state's competent authority can propose, and it has to be a single substance, which is relevant in this case, as I'll show you in a minute or two. for consideration under the Community Rolling Action Plan, which has a slightly disappointing acronym of CORAP. And then it goes through a standard toxicological risk assessment, as I understand it, and a classification at the end, at which point a label is or isn't deemed appropriate. And it's that particular bit that we were particularly interested in. And then again, as I understand it, you'll know more, the decision as what to do with these chemicals is one based on things like competitiveness and cost benefit and things, not necessarily toxicological science. And to date, 3 respiratory sensitizers are categorized as SVHCs. Slightly odd, 3 to my way of thinking. If you gave me a pen and paper and half an hour, I could probably come up with 70 chemicals that are capable of causing asthma in the workplace. So something's a bit odd. And of course, a chemical does not want to be in the SVHC category because that has the potential to lead to authorization, which is, as I understand it, the dustbin of chemicals. But none of the respiratory sensitizers have gone into that box. Isocyanates, which are not an SVHC, are, as I understand it, next year going on a restricted list. But that's a bit like, if authorization is the death penalty, restriction is sort of half an hour's community service, or it seems that way to me. So, with methacrylates, I became aware that at almost exactly the same time we were seeing this patient, the French had proposed that methyl methacrylate be considered as to go through this process, and they put together a dossier at the end of 2018 with a conclusion that you can see there on the right. And as I said, it was almost exactly the same time that this poor woman had come under our clinical care. So I have a network of similar-minded colleagues across Europe, and suggested that we might gather together all the acrylate cases we had seen in the last 5 years and proven by the same kind of methods I've shown you for this patient. And they were kind enough to agree. And so in 2019, quite deliberately, we published this paper in the Journal of Allergy and Clinical Immunology. The first author is a colleague of mine called Hilla Suohaleto in Helsinki, and she's first author because they contributed the most cases. And rightly or wrongly, I was the corresponding author, and I'll show you why that I wish I hadn't been in a minute or two. And we were quite blunt here, really, because in the discussion of this article, it made it clear that in our view, methyl methacrylates should be labeled as a sensitizer on the basis of the cases, and there were about 25 cases of methacrylates in this publication, which was considered to be more than had been available before. So the industry duly trashed us, which, I mean, I don't mind being trashed, but I think trashing my colleagues is a bit. This is just a case series. It's not science. I mean, it's not heavy science, so a little difficult. But the ECHA, about 18 months ago, deemed that actually the industry defence was insufficient, and their risk assessment committee suggested that it be classified as a sensitizer. And then, of course, it's gone to appeal. So at the moment, the situation is under appeal. And for the last 18 months, Hila and I have been absolutely inundated with emails from the chemical industry. I don't want you to read this one. This one came in about a fortnight ago. I'm basically asking for more and more granular detail about these cases, which this is from I don't know whether you can read it. The strap, do you think stay healthy, keep a distance is a good strap line for a chemical company? Anyway, that's where we are. And if we just go back to the patient, the cause of her asthma was picked up very quickly. And, not through any fault of ours, but she got to us very quickly. And so her asthma is completely cleared up. And she won't have any more problems again with asthma. But her immune memory will never forget methacrylate, so she'll not be able to work with them again. And because she's no longer exposed, she's fine. But the cost of being no longer exposed is no longer working in that industry. And actually the toll on her has been very considerable in her sort of mental state and her career, basically. She's not allowed to, or won't be able to do what she wanted to do. And Roger, I think that's about 15 minutes. All right. Yeah. Okay. Thank you very much.
Brilliant, Paul. Thank you very much. Excellent timekeeping. And a lovely story, actually, and really nice to come full circle and actually hear how the patient's doing, which you don't always hear sometimes. Any questions for Paul? Frank?
Paul, that was a pretty sharp drop in FEV1. Was she the only one in the workshop that was sensitive? And
so again, in our sort of clinical experience, if you work in a small business which doesn't have an experience of occupational asthma, you get blamed because you're the only one. It doesn't affect everybody equally, like most toxins. And this is an immune response, so there's quite a strong host susceptibility to it. So as far as we know, she's the only one. And because she's the only one, the employer says, well, you must have been doing something wrong. And that's the story we hear again and again. Of course, having seen what happened to her, nobody else is going to put their heads above the parapet. So who knows is the truth. Usually it's sporadic. Now that lung function drop of 25% is after being in a chamber, admittedly quite a small chamber, for just a minute or so, with symptoms not as strong as she would get after work. So at work she must be dropping by 40-50%.
Question at the back?
Was the employer in any way prepared to consider finding a replacement alternative?
Yeah, so we went through a long process of my version of hierarchy of control, and no, they weren't. Well, they didn't try very hard, but we did look at alternative glues, containment, ventilation, all sorts of things. But I think she talks about it, doesn't she? Reasonable adjustments is subjective. She was very angry by this time.
Anything yet? Just at the back. Matt, at the back.
Did you say immunotherapy? Yeah. Now, I may be wrong, but I don't know anyone who offers immunotherapy for a chemical allergen. There is, and there have been sort of attempts at immunotherapy for people who've developed asthma from proteins like latex and things, and in bakeries. But because the market's quite small, relatively, no immunotherapy manufacturer is going to put much effort into it. It's not like hay fever everyone's got.
Super. Thank you very much, Paul. And as a little incentive for the speakers, if you keep on time, you'll get a beautiful little... So, Paul, you've done very well. So thank you so much. Little thank you. Thank you. Take care.